Comparing the U.S. economy under Donald Trump and Joe Biden, in the context of less than a year until the U.S. presidential election, economic issues are the top concern of voters despite the rapid economic recovery after the pandemic. Incumbent U.S. President Joe Biden is still having difficulty convincing Americans that his policies are improving their financial situation. In polls, the majority of Americans still trust the former president's handling of the economy more. However, each administration has left its own mark. Mr. Joe Biden created 14 million more jobs in less than 3 years, reducing billions of dollars in student debt. Meanwhile, Mr. Donald Trump presided over a period of low interest rate inflation and gas prices. Here are specific comparisons according to the Washington Post. Economic growth. In general, the U.S. economy has grown steadily under Donald Trump and Joe Biden. GDP has grown about 22% since Biden took office, compared with 14% during Trump's tenure as the pandemic forced the economy into a sharp and sudden recession. The economy then rebounded quickly, thanks in part to trillions of dollars in stimulus, and was growing again when Trump left office. The economy has now recorded 5 consecutive quarters of growth under Biden after 6 months of contraction. The latest expansion last year was supported by strong consumer spending, which accounts for about 70% of the economy, as well as infrastructure and green energy projects, but economists say the current pace of growth is unsustainable and will cool. Job growth in recent years has far exceeded experts' expectations, fueling the economy's meteoric rise. Employers created 14 million jobs during Biden's presidency, averaging more than 400,000 positions per month, while the economy created an average of 176,000 jobs per month. During Donald Trump's first 3 years before the COVID-related shutdowns that abruptly wiped out more than 20 million jobs, unemployment was low during both Donald Trump's and Joe Biden's presidencies. Under Trump, unemployment fell to a half-century low of 3.5% in early 2020, just before the pandemic. During Biden's presidency, it fell even further to 3.4% earlier this year. Gasoline prices. Gasoline prices have a direct impact on how Americans view the economy. This is one area where Trump's presidency has been better for Americans. Under Joe Biden, the pandemic-related problems, the war in Ukraine, and spikes in demand have all sent gas prices skyrocketing. Since 2020, gas prices have more than doubled from April 2020 to April 2022, from $1.84 to $4.11 a gallon. Gas prices in the U.S. peaked at nearly $5 a gallon in June 2022. Higher gas prices have been a concern for much of Joe Biden's presidency. Home prices. Owning a home is one of the best ways for Americans to build wealth. But overall home ownership has become much less accessible under Biden. Home prices have skyrocketed during the pandemic by 49% from spring 2020 to fall 2022. Higher costs have pushed housing affordability to an all-time low. The median home price is now $43,100, much higher than before the pandemic when Donald Trump took office, and mortgage interest rates have more than doubled in the past 2 years from about 3.1% to about 7%. Inflation. Inflation is a challenge for President Joe Biden. Prices have risen rapidly since the pandemic, leading to the highest inflation in more than 40 years. Americans face rising costs for almost everything from groceries to cars to healthcare. Although inflation has recently eased from its peak last summer, prices are still about 3% higher than a year ago. Voters consistently cite inflation as their top economic concern. Interest rates. The U.S. president has little power to influence interest rates because the U.S. Federal Reserve operates independently. During Joe Biden's term, the Fed has raised interest rates 11 times. To curb inflation, the federal funds rate rose to a 22-year high of 5.25 to 5.5%. Each rate hike or even the hint of a rate hike sent ripples through the economy, leading to higher interest rates on a variety of loans, including mortgages currently at around 7%, personal loans at 12%, and credit cards at over 20%. Disposable income. During the Donald Trump years, disposable income, real income left after taxes and inflation of Americans, increased steadily until the pandemic appeared. From January 2017 to January 2020 it increased by about 10%, while during Joe Biden's term stimulus money decreased and prices rose, causing large fluctuations in household income since 2020. Stock market. The stock market grew rapidly during Donald Trump's term and continued to rise, under Joe Biden, after a slowdown. Stock prices rebounded last year as investors became optimistic that the monetary tightening cycle was complete. W. Jones vs S&P 500 vs Nasdaq both hit all-time highs this month. Student debt. Student loan debt has been on the rise for nearly 2 decades. Joe Biden took office pledging to reduce the burden of student debt, but an ambitious plan that included $400 billion in debt forgiveness has been blocked by Republican lawmakers and the Supreme Court, so he's looking for other ways to help. The White House has so far forgiven $132 billion in student loan debt for more than 3.6 million people. They've also increased aid for low and middle-income students. Consumer sentiment has been depressed despite the strength of the economy. Americans have been depressed when it comes to their own finances during Biden's tenure. Consumer sentiment fell to a record low in June 2022 when gas prices peaked, and has since recovered somewhat but remains lower than it was during Trump's presidency. Federal deficit. The federal deficit, the difference between what the government takes in and spends, peaked under Trump. Although both he and Biden have added trillions of dollars to the national debt, the deficit has grown every year since Trump's presidency, as sweeping tax cuts and the government's response to the pandemic have added $7.8 trillion to the debt. Since then, the deficit has narrowed in Biden's first 2 years in office, but this year it has increased 23% to $1.7 trillion. The growing deficit combined with political turmoil in Congress is raising alarm bells for credit rating agencies.